Curator Alex Nahwegahbow led a group of us on a tour of Temporal Re-Imaginings at the Nahwegahbow exhibition space in the lobby of the Canada Council for the Arts in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. The exhibit invites visitors to reimagine time through Indigenous art. My name is Sylvia Dueck, and as part of the Decolonizing Curatorial Pedagogies workshop in Ottawa, I had the opportunity to interview Alex about her exhibit, as well as our shared experiences as Indigenous women working in academia, museums, and galleries. This workshop was facilitated by the Partnership Development Project, Thinking Through the Museum, Difficult Knowledge in Public. Alex is an independent curator, research assistant, and PhD student at Carleton University. I'm a research assistant, as well as an Aboriginal program guide at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and an art history major at the University of Winnipeg. Nasi Dishnakas, a singing thunderbird. My name is Sylvia Dueck, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here today. I want to actually thank Dr. Angela Filler for inviting me to be a research assistant on this project. I just want to provide a little bit of background on myself, and then I'll let Alex introduce herself as well. Besides working with Angela and the research group, I also work as an Antanu Dage at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, which means a person that translates for the people. And the CMHR has a new program, or a program that started since the museum's inception, which is called the Mikanak Kea Tour. And what the Mikanak Kea Tour means is Mikanak means turtle in Ojibwe, Kea means house of knowledge. And so it's a program that has been developed, and as far as we know, it's never been developed anywhere at any sort of cultural institution. But it's bringing the 7 sacred teachings through the architecture of the museum and the symbolism there. And so I was chosen by a council of 7 elders to present this tour, which I feel very honored to be able to do so. And once again, the 7 elders have an equal partnership with the Federal Museum, which is once again something that's never been done. So there's been some challenges along the way, but this is sort of where my area of focus lies regarding what is a role of an Indigenous person in a museum. And so that's really where my research also has been taking me. So I'll let Alexandra introduce herself and her background.
Anin Kinoea, Gasinio Indishnakas, Ottawa Donjaba, Mangan Dodem, Rigacha Nam on Piki Kitom. Hi everyone, I'm Alex Gasinio Nahwegahbow. I'm from Ottawa. I grew up in Ottawa, or just outside of Ottawa. But I'm a member of Whitefish River First Nation, which is Anishinaabe Nation in the Manitoulin Island District. And I'm also Ganyakahaga, so I'm also Mohawk on my mom's side. She's from Ganawage. I'm a PhD student here at Carleton in the Visual Culture stream of Cultural Mediations at Carleton University's Institute for Comparative Studies in Literature, Art, and Culture. So that's where the ICSLAC comes from. So my research primarily, I guess we'll talk more about this, but the objects that I look at are actually historical objects. I work with museums, but I also have a strong interest in contemporary Indigenous art. So I guess we'll get started. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We really weren't expecting this many people, so thank you. It's really wonderful. And thank you to all the organizers for putting together this workshop. It's been a great day so far.
So the purpose of this interview today is just to promote a dialogue between Alex and myself in regarding our experiences traversing both academia as well as museums and gallery work as Indigenous women. So for some of us that have visited Alex's exhibition yesterday at the Canada Council, it's interesting to note that it was actually, as Alex mentioned to me, that one of the first, or the first actually, Indigenous curated all Indigenous content show at the Canada Council, which I think is a really amazing thing, especially for you, being that that's your first exhibit that you've ever done. So a few questions I'd like to ask about that is, what would you say were some of your biggest challenges in this experience for you?
I think a big one of the big challenges was mostly confidence, I think, because it was my, the first, they did it, so part of how it ended up coming to be was Canada Council did an open call. They were looking for a curator for a show on Aboriginal Art Showcase. And I saw it, but I didn't think anything of it really. And Sandra Dick, who's the director of QAG, sent it to me. She said, you have to apply. So she really encouraged me to do it. But so I think confidence was the main thing for me. That I really was sort of holding me back. And I think, I think for being an Indigenous person, I think a lot of the time you're kind of searching for your own voice. And putting something out there like that, Indigenous worldviews, things that have historically been, people have said were no good or weren't interested. I think doing that is scary. putting anything out there that is yours, that you make, I think is scary, but putting something out there that historically hasn't really been encouraged was a big challenge, I think. I think that was probably one of the biggest things.
Mm. So you have 3 themes throughout the show, which is called Temporal Re-Imaginings, and so the show discusses histories, memories, and myth. Can you tell me why those themes were ones that you chose for this particular exhibit?
Yeah, so I guess the inspiration for the show, and I'm sorry for everyone who's hearing this twice, or who's hearing this more than once, who's been through the exhibition and has been on a tour. But I think the original inspiration, I guess, happened a few years ago. I was fishing with my dad and my uncles and my cousins. We went fishing up along the Whitefish River, which is what our reserve is named after. And there's a special spot along the Whitefish River that's within our reserve boundaries, and it's a place where the pickerel come to spawn in the spring. And it's a very special place for my community. I guess after they made treaty, when they were creating the boundaries for our reserve, our chief at the time made sure that our reserve boundary would cover the Whitefish River, this spot along the Whitefish River where we would fish. And so we were fishing there, and my dad was telling me this, and he was talking about the significance of this site and how important it is, and how important it seems to have always been, to the point that we wanted, our chief, our leader at the time, really wanted to make sure that we maintained care and control over this site to ensure that, people to come before him, or people to come after him, like myself, would be able to fish there. So my dad was telling me this, and I had this really strange, really bizarre feeling in my body. And actually, after hearing Dr. Amy Lontree's talk yesterday, when she put up that slide on the blood memory gallery, I thought, because I've been trying to grapple with what is this feeling that I had, and I was trying to put into words, I guess, what that feeling was, and I didn't know how to communicate it. And so I looked to artists to see how other artists are kind of dealing with this idea of time, and how time seems to be this very, I felt it kind of fold in on itself in that moment when I was fishing with my family. Even though I had never fished there on that site before, there was something like in my bones, almost in my body, that remembered it, even though I had never experienced it before. So I felt sort of the impact of all of the people that have come before me. So maybe that was blood memory. I'm not maybe that's what that is, what that feeling was. So that was kind of the inspiration about why I've been thinking about this notion of time and Indigenous conceptions of time, and how different it is from a Western perspective. I'm trained as an art historian, and so I'm constantly battling with this idea of art historical timelines, and I want to put everything on a timeline and a chronology, but we don't think in that way a lot of the time. We think in time is a bit more malleable, and in our stories, they happen in this place that seems to evade time. They happen in this other realm where people can easily move from the past to the present to the future. They can shapeshift, transform. So I think that's kind of where all these themes about time and memory and futurism and imagining an alternative indigenized future kind of came from.
And it's interesting, I can relate to sort of wearing those two hats, and one foot in the Western world and one world in the traditional world. And I know when they did the archaeological dig of the CMHR, that land, there was many artifacts that were found, and in fact there was 3 that presented themselves together, which was part of a vessel, a buffalo skull, and part of a pipe. And so, for me as an art historian, I want to care for those. I want to study them. I want to classify them. But then there's another part of me that wants that to go back to where it belongs, to the right people. And those items were repatriated back to the people and brought back into the land. But there is, that negotiation between the two worlds. And speaking actually of that, I want to talk to you about, of course, some of your history starting in academia was the study of indigenous material culture, or material, sorry. How do you find you negotiate between, starting to look at artifacts versus the contemporary indigenous art? And there's sort of like this long-standing conversation about art versus artifact. So I just wanted to know what your thoughts are, or how you've sort of traversed those worlds.
Well, it's funny because when I came to Carleton in my master's, the only thing I wanted to look at was contemporary Indigenous art, and that was sort of my only interest at the time. And I was sort of dead set on studying that when I came here. So I guess contemporary art is my first love. And I came here and I took my first graduate class with Ruth Phillips, who's my current supervisor now. And I think the course, when I signed up for it, when I registered, it just said art from the Great Lakes, or Great Lakes art, Indigenous art from the Great Lakes. And I was like, perfect, this is exactly what I'm looking for. So I registered, and then in the first class we got the syllabus, and it was all historical, material culture mostly. And I kind of was like, at the time I thought it would I don't want to say I thought it would be boring, but really that's kind of what I thought was oh, we're going to be looking at old things like beads, and these are things that my family always had in our house. We always had baskets and stuff like that, and I always loved them, but they were always there. I don't want to say I never found them beautiful. I definitely did, but I really wanted to study, contemporary art, and I wasn't really interested in the older stuff. And in one of the first classes with Ruth, she said, it's important to study contemporary Indigenous art, but in order to understand a lot of the visual language, a lot of the context, a lot of what these artists are talking about, it's important to understand this history and this stuff from the past. And so it reminded me of, you hear this adage sometimes in Indian country where you have to know where you come from in order to know where you're going. And so it was kind of a way for me, and I've talked about this before, I kind of grew up, my brother and I were the first urbanized, I guess, generation of our family, the first ones to grow up off reserve in the city. And so we kind of always felt, or I did anyway, I don't know how my brother felt, I won't speak on his behalf, but I always felt like I didn't really belong, or, my brother and I were the only Native kids in our school. And I feel like when you're a kid, you kind of just want to fit in and be a wallflower. And I always felt a little bit different. I mentioned this yesterday, but especially lunchtime was always a time where I really stood out, because kids would have sandwiches and alphagettis, and I would have moose meat from my dad's hunt. And so I always felt, I was kind of the girl with the sort of the strange last name. And so I felt, I guess, ashamed to be who I was. And my family always, they told us where we came from. And in the family home, it was very, a very nurturing, encouraging place. But outside of the family home, I always kind of felt displaced, or I didn't feel connected, or I didn't know where I fit in. So this idea of I hadn't figured out how to walk in those two worlds yet. I was really struggling with that. And so when Ruth said that in that class, I thought okay, in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you come from. And I hadn't really figured out where I came from yet, and at that point. And so I think looking at historical Indigenous art has really given me a chance to find out more about who I am. And the first time I actually went to a museum, the collections, and I saw objects and I held them, it was such a wonderful experience, because I saw these things that people that lived here, they knew the land intimately. They could make, a basket out of birch bark that was watertight. And that's, I felt proud to come from a people that have that history. to see these, beautiful things. And once I learned to really look at stuff, you really see a lot of the beauty that is embodied in them, and these whole knowledge systems that are embodied in these objects. So I think that's sort of how I have started looking at both of them, because a lot of these languages, these visual languages that artists use, they've always used, so that they're grabbing things from the past but shifting them, transforming them into a contemporary context, and that doesn't make them any less authentic or any less indigenous. It just means they're contemporary and they're changing, and we've always done that. We've always adapted. We've always changed. We've always been a people kind of on the move that have done the best with what we have, and in very difficult times. So, and I think we continue to do that.
Great. There was a great. Before I even met Alex, I actually knew who she was. Right after we had the change in government, there was a CBC article that said explosion of Indigenous art, and so of course I clicked on that right away. And there was this interview by this really sharp woman, and I just thought, wow, this is, they talked about our show, and so it was really, I was really keen on, getting to know more about her work, and so this is really great that we're talking about it today. But what's really interesting about like in one of these articles that I've read that you've been interviewed in, and it talks about you being very isolated in your academic programs. And for myself, like I've been the only Indigenous art history student at the University of Winnipeg for the past 5 years. So there's been many challenges for myself, just having even the right mentor or someone to supervise a project for me. And I'm happy to say that we actually have hired an Indigenous art historian just as of this last year. But we have that in common. And what's happened to me for this, I'm in my last year, my honors degree, and I had to really petition the chair of the history department to allow an Indigenous research methodology class as part of my art history degree. So I know that you've discussed using some of these methodologies within your work, and if you can maybe talk a little bit about how they inform your work.
So I think generally, like, the population on campus, Indigenous population, is growing, which is really exciting to see. But often the majority of us in, our cohorts were not Aboriginal. And so you kind of struggle with, feeling like an island and feeling like you're alone. But I have felt a lot of support, actually, from the Carleton community and the Ottawa community. When I wanted to do this show, it was my first show, and I didn't know what I was getting into, I guess. Curating is a big job. My heart really goes out to curators. That is a big job. And I didn't know, I didn't know what I was getting into. And so the community of people from the institutions that we borrowed from, and the Ottawa community in Carleton, they really, really helped me out a lot and gave me a lot of really great feedback. And so I think the methodology, I don't even know if it's really a methodology, but understanding that relationships are important and that you're not by yourself, and you can always look to other people to help you out. And it's okay to ask for help and, to say, I don't know what I'm doing, and I want to learn. I'm really interested in that impulse because we have a lot of Indigenous people, for me anyway, I do have a lot of self-shame, I guess, when I don't know how to speak my language. I'm learning both of my languages. I'm slowly learning, but I don't know how to speak them fluently. I carry a lot of shame about that because I don't know those things. I don't know how to bead, or I can bead, but it's not good. I don't know how to harvest like ash to make a splint basket. So there's these things that I don't know how to do, and I was ashamed of that and feeling like those things are so part of who I am. How come I don't know how to do them? I should know how to do these things. I'm an Indigenous person. But, we've been born into this very difficult situation where we have limited access to things like our language. And so we can't blame ourselves or be ashamed of that. It's okay to say, I don't know how to do this, but I want to learn how. So I'm really interested, I guess, in that impulse to want to learn. So I don't really know if that's a methodology, but I guess just being humble about it and saying, I don't know how to do this. I need help. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. So Tanya Willard has stated that one of the strongest struggles is negotiating spaces and places. And I just want to talk a little bit about, first of all, my first experience here in Ottawa, which was 2 years ago. I came for 2 weeks to do some independent research. And, I was really disheartened in seeing that there was a lack of visibility for Indigenous people. I literally felt like I saw one person downtown, and even when I visited the museums and galleries, once again, there was, for me at that time, there wasn't really, I was disappointed in what I saw. So could you speak on a little bit of, our visible presence in the nation's capital, and maybe even touch on Jamie Coble's walking tour, which will be, some of the group will be experiencing later today.
Mm-hmm. So we sort of talked about this over the phone. How the city can often sort of render Indigenous presence invisible, or you feel like you don't recognize yourself in the city a lot of the times. And I think you had mentioned, particularly in the nation's capital, you really noticed a big difference from Winnipeg to here. And I think Ottawa is a very different kind of place because there are so many narratives that are going on here. And the Indigenous perspective or the Indigenous narrative sometimes gets lost in all of this other kind of noise that's going on. And so doing things like Jamie Coble's Indigenous Walks really draws attention to these little, we are here. You have to kind of maybe search for us, but we're here. And I think she really makes that presence visible in a really beautiful way. So Jamie Coble, she's a local Métis artist, and she does these Indigenous walks, Indigenous walking tours through Ottawa, and she shows the city of Ottawa through an Indigenous perspective. And so there are things throughout the city that do represent us, that reflect our presence here. And we did a tour with a group of students, Aboriginal students, and one girl, she was Mi'kmaq, and she was from the East Coast, and she said when she first came to Ottawa, she didn't feel like she was really represented here. It wasn't like a scary place, she just didn't really see herself in the city. But then on Jamie Coble's walk, she took us, through the city to different memorials. She talked about, social justice in front of, the courthouse, stuff like that. Talked about Indigenous war veterans. And the student was like, actually, she felt a little more welcome after going on that tour. And so I think, yeah, on first glance, you don't really see us here, maybe, but we are. You just have to maybe pay attention, and I guess that's sort of what I was hoping that the Canada Council show would also do, is just to create a place where people could go to, people who weren't aware of Indigenous worldviews or Indigenous art, who hadn't encountered that before, could go in a place and say, wow, these are really beautiful. They make beautiful things, and they think in really beautiful, creative ways. But then also for someone like, I don't know, an Indigenous person could walk in there and see, I recognize myself in this space. So it could be a place that could sort of be a place that was welcoming, and they would see words on the walls like Indigenous sovereignty and resurgence and feel good about that. So yeah,
actually, it's interesting, something just kind of came to me while you were talking about that, and sort of my connection to Indigenous art began probably about 15 years ago when I was living in Calgary, and I was late for work one morning, and I was rushing through all these business towers, and in this lobby, very much like the Canada Council where the show was at, were these 3 pieces from Norval Morceau. And I was really late, but something just stopped me, and I just stood there in awe. And so when I think about what your hopes for, that experience happened to me actually, and it's brought me to where I am today. So I think that's really kind of neat. So speaking of that exhibit, how do you see this exhibit sort of informing what you want to do next, or where you see yourself going for your next project?
Well, I do have a project on the go. I'm not sure how much we were allowed to share about it. But I am really interested in exploring more of those linkages between how people are drawing from the past and sort of shifting these, rethinking this notion of tradition. Like, what does tradition really mean? Traditions are things that we repeat, but just every time we repeat them, they necessarily change. And so rethinking this idea of tradition and this concept of kind of return, and how artists are drawing from traditions, but are reshaping them and rethinking them and incorporating, traditional, or things that we think of tradition, and incorporating them into their contemporary practice. So yeah, I think that's sort of where I'm going now, or really that permeability between like art and craft, like you had mentioned. These distinctions that we still so have to, still break down this distinction or break down that barrier. So I'm interested in that permeability between the two.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually just curious again about, some of those items that you've had the privilege to be around and work with. Was there any sort of situations where you felt that some of these items were maybe not handled in the right way? Like maybe they were, I'll just give an example. The Manitoba Museum has a sacred room, and so there's items there like pipes and they acknowledge that they're just keepers of these items, and that members of these communities can come in anytime they like, and they follow the highest protocols for this room. So I'm just wondering, have you ever been in a situation in your experience dealing with material culture where you felt that there has been mishandling of items or a lack of respect?
I can't think of a particular instance. I think things are really changing. I think access to collections is changing, which is good. I think thinking about objects, when you go to see objects, the first time I saw them, it was I had a really strong reaction to it, I guess. I really loved visiting with them, and you say visiting because you really feel like they're, they somehow have agency, or not that they're entirely alive, but that there's something, they're more than just objects. They're embodiments of this very complex worldview, and they're not just things. And so I haven't seen, I've been very lucky. I think I haven't had a bad experience yet. Hopefully I don't. But I think it is important for museums to really understand that relationship that we have to our objects and to things that are in museums. Because often, a museum can kind of seem like a depressing place. These objects, these things that have been so loved, especially when you see things that have been worn before, things that are really beautiful and they've been meticulously made, and you see all the love and care that went into it. And then they're either in like a glass box separate from life, or they're tucked away in like museum storage, and they're in a drawer in the dark, and it's, it makes you feel sad. And actually, I went on a workshop in Cooperstown at Otsego, and it's a native art workshop, and Joe Horsecapture was there. He's a curator he's a Ananin curator at NMAI. He's an Indigenous second generation curator. And I think he's got a really, really tough job at the NMAI. And I hope he doesn't mind me quoting him, because I do it all the time, because it really, it reminds me about why working with objects is so important. Because I think, too, you struggle with, again, this idea of two worlds, because you work with these objects that are so important, and you want them to be at home. But at the same time, you work in museums, so it's this weird, like you feel this like constant like tension of working with objects in a Western space. And he was saying, he was talking about museums as being these places that do have this kind of negative. They've inherited a really difficult history, and as Native people, it doesn't seem like a great place. Really, reminds you of a lot of, it brings a lot of painful memories. And he said, and these objects seem like they're lonely, but he said it's because of that loneliness that he encourages people to visit them. So it's important to have Indigenous people working with these objects so they can see a familiar face, so that, they can hear their language, or they can be sort of surrounded, by people who understand the worldview that they come from. So I think it's important for museums to really understand that and how these objects really are extensions of our life.
I wanted to just touch on the idea of being a token. I know for myself, there's times that I've been at the museum, at the CMHR, where I'm wearing my ceremonial skirt, and I've been on the terrace doing a smudge, and there's a big window, and people can see me, and I feel like I'm this living exhibit. But there's that idea that especially being very isolated sometimes in these situations, especially traversing the museological world and the gallery world. Have you ever felt or dealt with that personally?
Yeah, I've felt like the token before. I feel like a lot of Indigenous people know what that feels like, to be the token, where you're supposed to be providing the Indigenous perspective on this giant thing, and it's a lot of pressure. I mean, you don't like feeling like you're tokenized, but then also, if someone is looking to you to speak on behalf of your entire race, it's really difficult because this is a tough question. But I mean, we were kind of talking about this sort of at dinner last night. We had a conversation about how there really is a thirst for this knowledge, for incorporating Indigenous worldviews, the Indigenous voice, Indigenous perspectives. And so when someone asks you, we're doing a talk or a workshop on something like museums, we need an Indigenous person. You don't want to say no to that because it's an opportunity to share what you know with people that want to know. So I don't know if that's really tokenism, but it is this thing where, you don't want to say no to something like that, and it is an opportunity to teach. And it's difficult. Yeah. But then it also is difficult because you feel like you don't want to be the person that's representing everyone's views. And I mean, especially, when something like I Don't Know More happened, I immediately felt like, okay, I need to be armed with like all of this information. So I researched everything. I was reading news, blogs, and I was trying to get as much information as I could, so I could be armed with like all this stuff. So people could be like, "Oh, I don't know more. How come the Indians are so mad?" And I could be like, "Well," and all these reasons. And but that was exhausting. But it's, I think that's like I don't know. It's difficult. It's really difficult.
Mm-hmm. I want to just touch on as well what maybe you could talk a little bit about when you feel art is decolonizing, or if you believe that art making is a form of decolonization. What are your thoughts around that?
I think it definitely is a form of decolonization. Because these things that we've created haven't been encouraged, or they really were said like these are no good, and we've always adapted to new materials that have come in, or when we've been able to sort of shapeshift our visual language so that it changed, but we were still like hiding our own little worldviews in there. So I think it's always been a form of decolonization. It's been a way, like I'm thinking, in some of the work that I've done, I've looked at traditional, these old Anishinaabe iconography, and we use, this image of the 4 quadrants, so it's like the medicine wheel. And then when we started incorporating like floral beadwork and using this, use of calico fabrics and stuff like that, and the missionaries were teaching young girls to create things that the tourists wanted, create things that are pretty, kind of let go of these geometric pagan designs that were so spiritually charged, use other things, and so use flowers. And so these women started, beading flowers, but a lot of these flowers they have 4 petals on them. And so we kind of see that as they're shape-shifting this, this very spiritually charged image of the 4 quadrants and turning it into a floral design. So they're still using their iconography, but they're putting it, they're keeping it in this kind of hiding place that was very strategic, I think. And so I think, we've always done that. And so I think it's always been this decolonizing practice. And I think it continues to be that way. And I think I quoted this yesterday too, but in the intro to Amy Lontry's book, she quotes Winona Wheeler, and she says the decolonization is about empowerment, and it's about trusting our own worldviews and trusting that we have the ability to make change. And so I think that really resonated with me. Decolonization is empowerment, and I think that's what artists do. They communicate these worldviews, and when I see like you said, when you saw like Norval Morris, so you felt that's a good feeling. When you see stuff like that on the walls and you recognize yourself, that makes you feel good, and it makes you feel good to come from those people. And I think that's what art does.
I think I'm going to end on that note because I think that's a really high note, and I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your experience, and you're definitely an influence for me moving forward in my academic career and as a curator as well. And I just want to say Chima Goch. So.